I'm David Flint, and this is Conversations with Conservatives, coming to you from SafeWorlds television on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. And my guest today is Senator Bob Day, Chairman of Family First and Senator for South Australia. Welcome, Senator.
Good afternoon, David.
Senator, you're standing in the election which takes place on the beginning of July. Why are you standing?
Well, that's a very good question. Why am I standing? Because I've seen the major parties in this country attacking each other rather than tackling the nation's problems. I think it's important to have independent voices, minor parties in particular, in the Parliament. I've noticed in just my short time in the Senate how much there can be a groupthink, and
just on that, if I could interrupt you, Senator, just on that, the Senate seems to have a particularly left-wing air about it. There seems to be an emphasis there on left-wing views, even in parts of the Liberal Party, certainly the Labor Party, Senator Xenophon, and the Greens. They all seem to present a rather similar view. Is that your impression?
Yes, it is. In fact, Senator Xenophon votes with the Greens most of the time. Even the Labor Party supports government legislation more often than does Senator Xenophon. So yes, there is definitely a lean to the left in the Senate. So, and even amongst the crossbench, it didn't start off that way, as a number of them were under the Palmer United Party banner and supported the government and shall we say, the more conservative pieces of legislation. But once they were free of the Palmer shackles, shall we say, they reverted to type and tended to vote more with Labor and the Greens than with the Conservative side of politics.
What I'm noticing among traditional Liberal voters is some dissatisfaction with the Liberal Party, firstly in relation to what happened in the overthrow of Tony Abbott, which they think is unfair, but more recently in relation to the superannuation policy, which was suddenly announced in the budget, which seemed to be retrospective in nature and which seemed to go very much against the base of the Liberal Party. Is that your impression?
Oh, most definitely. And it's the reason that the government, the Liberal Party, has gone down this path is in a desperate chase for cash and for revenue rather than cut spending. As we know, the Conservative tradition is one of living within your means and hard work and thrift and those sorts of things. But we've now seen this big spending agenda coming from both parties. We're now over 25% of GDP. We're at Whitlam era levels of government spending, spending on welfare and spending on all manner of things is just going off the scale. It's and any efforts towards reducing spending doesn't last more than a few moments, and it becomes a cash grab for whether it's superannuation or increasing taxes. That seems to be the easy way out for them.
One thing which the Australian has every day is the spendometer, and you get the impression that there's an auction by both sides offering all sorts of good things to the electorate, all with borrowed money.
Exactly. Scott Morrison's first budget this year projected spending of $450 billion and revenues of about $410 billion. So there's a $40 billion shortfall just this coming year.
So what will you do? What will you do, Senator, when the superannuation bills, if they come up to the Senate, what will your position be?
Well, I would certainly vote against them. I was asked earlier on, well, what would I do to rein in government spending? And I suggested the abolition of a couple of Commonwealth government departments, like the Commonwealth Department of Education, which doesn't run any schools, the Commonwealth Department of Health, which doesn't run any hospitals. This duplication of federal and state roles and responsibilities, the duplication is costing the nation a fortune.
But doesn't the Department of Education administer that safe schools policy? Isn't that a wonderful achievement of the Commonwealth government and of the Labor Party?
Well, I think just the very name, the Orwellian name of it, safe schools, when they actually really mean dangerous schools. I think when they start calling things which are bad good and things which are good bad, you know you're on that slippery slope. Getting back to federalism, though, and the budget, the golden rule should be those who spend the money should have to raise the money.
Well, I think that's very true. I'm sorry now, we're going to go to a break. We'll come back in a few minutes' time. Thank you, Senator. I'm David Flint, and this is Conversations with Conservatives, and I'm speaking to Senator Bob Day, Senator for South Australia. Senator, could I ask you a couple of questions about the situation in South Australia? South Australia used to be a leading manufacturing state, but it seems as though it's slipped behind in that regard, perhaps due to energy costs. And the other thing I'm hearing is that the farmers of South Australia feel that they're being targeted. They're not getting the water that they should be entitled to. They're being dictated to concerning vegetation. What is going on in South Australia?
Well, it is a sad story. South Australia has become a mendicant state. It was once the case that more than a dozen of Australia's top 100 publicly listed companies had their head offices in Adelaide. Some great names like Faldings and News Corporation, South Corp, Normandy Mining. There was quite a list. Like I say, more than a dozen of the top 100 companies on the Australian Stock Exchange. We're down to one, which is just Santos. And when you look at the decline over the last 30 years, when South Australia was the number 3 state in the Commonwealth, when Adelaide was the 3rd largest city, South Australia held its own because it was competitive. It was competitive in areas of power, energy costs, that is, water costs, land and housing affordability. People who had missed out on because of the spiralling cost of housing in Sydney and Melbourne could come to Adelaide, and it was a very attractive place. There was a very high standard of living, a very high quality of life in Adelaide and in the Adelaide Hills, but a very low cost.
But isn't this going to be improved by the ambitious renewable energy target that you have?
Au contraire, it's driving up power prices to the highest, certainly the highest in the nation and amongst the highest in the world. So South Australia's quest to become a competitive state again is really suffering. Water prices, the government is now using water and power and land as revenue sources. They are almost a form of taxation.
Shouldn't you be a food bowl for the nation and for exports?
We certainly could be. South Australia certainly has the climate and the wherewithal to do that. But our labour costs, our power costs, our water costs, our land costs are just driving the state more and more into dependency.
Your state was once the target of an enormous amount of immigration, which seemed to go off very successfully. But Australia seems to be having some problems in the immigration area.
Yeah, South Australia's got a very proud history of immigration. In fact, our governor, Hugh Van Lay, was a former Vietnamese refugee, and now he's risen to the number one position in South Australia, and that's the governor, and he is extremely popular and been a tremendous role model for migrants. We have the Greek community, the Italian community, the former Yugoslavian community have done a marvellous job here in South Australia with market gardens and all manner of things. And South Australia was a very attractive destination for migrants, but not so much these days, which is really sad. And at the end of the day, it comes down to leadership and bad management. And our politicians are just managers doing a job. If they're no good, they should be sacked. And this present mob, certainly in South Australia, are very poor managers and should be sacked.
One of the big pieces of news recently has been this terrible massacre in Orlando, and the Americans, the Republican candidate for the presidency, feels that there should be a strong position taken in relation to the radical Islamic people. What do you think? What do you think the Australian government should be doing in that regard?
Well, this is a very difficult area, of course, but this nation was built on a shared values, a common set of values that believes in democracy, and it's Judeo-Christian heritage values that govern every aspect of our democracy. And if people do not subscribe to that or do not believe in those sort of ideals, then we should be very wary of inviting them in.
We do have a number of people coming to Australia who aren't of the Jewish or Christian religions, that they seem to fit in well. We have Hindus and we have Buddhists, and we don't seem to have any difficulties there. We do have difficulties with some members of the Muslim community, and I notice there seems to be a reluctance on the part of some people in authority to recognise that there does seem to be a problem.
Well, they're in denial, and they'll pay a heavy price for denying a reality of the way the world works. And I for one, would have no qualms of saying that Australia is built on democratic Judeo-Christian principles, and anyone who shares our values is welcome.
If I could return you to that question of finance, which is central, both major parties, seem to be determined to keep on building up, increasing significantly the amount we're borrowing, which means that we have this enormous interest bill each year, which if we lose our AAA credit rating will probably increase, apart from increasing because the principal is increasing. We're not like Greece. We can't look to Germany to pay our debts. We don't have anybody to look after us. We're not the United States. We don't have a reserve currency to protect us. Will this lead us into a dangerous area?
It most certainly will. It's been for the past 9 years since Peter Costello was Treasurer and Nick Minchin was Finance Minister. We've abandoned the principles of of economic reality. There's an old saying that anything not based on economic reality is doomed to failure. And if you think you can spend more than you earn, then you're going to come crashing down at some stage. I noticed on that spendometer that you mentioned earlier that the government is up to about 5 billion as of today. I think the Labor's at 15 billion. The Greens are off the scale, I think, at 50 billion or thereabouts. But it's just not sustainable. You're right, the current debt is $500 billion. It's costing $1 billion a month in interest, $37 million a day, just to pay the interest.
It's very serious, isn't it? At this point, we're going to go to another break, and we'll come back in a few moments. Thank you, Senator. I'm David Flint, and this is Conversations with Conservatives, and I'm speaking with Senator Bob Day, Senator for South Australia. Senator, I can't help but notice that you are one of the few self-made men, one of the few businessmen in the Parliament. I've read very much some of your papers and works on housing affordability, and I must say I was very impressed with the way in which you dealt with that issue and the solutions which you offered. But on that question of being a self-made man, am I correct there? Are you one of the few self-made businessmen in the Parliament?
Probably one of the very few, but that's one of the why or how I actually got into Parliament, or what when I realised that what needed to be done. I've come from the housing industry, and over a number of years I saw a decline in employment opportunities for young people. I saw housing affordability problems. So I raised these at my industry association meeting, and when you start talking like that, the first thing they do is make you the president and send you off to lobby government. So, which I did. I went off to Canberra to explain to our political masters what needed to be done to address the youth unemployment, or the decline in youth employment in the housing sector, and also housing affordability. And I realised that many of the members of Parliament didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And then I realised that most of them had never had a proper job, if you know what I mean. They had gone to university, been employed as political staffers, and then became politicians themselves. So,
is there something then wrong with the pre-selection process of the two principal parties?
Most definitely. It's controlled by power brokers in both parties. I ran for pre-selection myself and came up against the party machine, and noticed, that was in the Liberal Party, I noticed just how tightly pre-selections are controlled by a certain few. And as a result of that, in conversations with some like-minded minor party um, uh, thinkers, I joined Family First and ran as a Senate candidate for Family First and was elected. And I've now been able to say things and raise things in the Parliament that I would never have been able to do had I been a member of one of the major parties.
Is the control of pre-selections, does that even apply in cases where there are plebiscites of the party members? That is to say, the party members are supposed to choose the candidate for their area.
Oh, it's very easy for power brokers to get around plebiscites. So that's what I thought as well, that if it's a vote of all the members of the party in that particular electorate, then it shouldn't be too difficult. But it's they have ways and means of ensuring that their particular selected candidate is the one who gets up, regardless of whether it's a plebiscite. There are ways of getting around the plebiscite.
Does this involve holding a plebiscite in a difficult to access area?
All those sorts of things, holding off announcing the retirement of a sitting member. Look, there's a strategy in place, and it works very, very well for those who know how to work the system. But
yes, coming back to the question of youth unemployment, when the government proposed in the 2014 budget that there should be a break between leaving school and getting the dole, I think they proposed 6 months. You had what I thought was a realistic variation of that, did you not?
Yes, I did. I suggested that that's fine, provided those young people who know where they can get a job are allowed to do so. So, for example, if a young person living in a country town or rural area is living at home rent-free and driving mum or dad's car, have got no cost of living at all, they should be allowed to opt out of the workplace regulation system, if you like, and if they know where they can get a job or learn a trade with a local diesel mechanic or a local hairdresser or whatever, they should be allowed to do that. But of course, that exemption or that opting out was not accepted by the government, the Liberal coalition government. So therefore, I refuse to agree to penalise any young person from getting a job or from receiving the New Start allowance if they weren't permitted to get a job. I think it's grossly unfair to say to somebody that no, you can't go to work. If you're sitting at home getting $5 an hour on the dole and you want to work on a Sunday for $20 an hour, but it's against the law because the penalty rate's $40, then that is grossly unfair to the young person then to penalise them and take away their unemployment benefits for 6 months.
A military friend of mine, acquaintance of mine, suggests that the unemployed who leave school should be offered the alternative of either getting a job or alternatively joining the army, and that would provide them with the requisite training that might help them in subsequent life. What do you think of that?
Well, that's okay, but they when you say they could get a job, but to get a job and overcome 3,000 pages of workplace regulation, everything from penalty rates to unfair dismissals to holidays and a whole lot of other things that a lot of young people do not need. And this is the great tragedy, that the people writing the laws today, that they got into the workforce, their entry level was very, very low when wage levels were low, regulation was low. They were able to get their foot on the first rung of the employment ladder relatively easily. But now we've put huge barriers and obstacles across the road to employment, and then we say, oh, well, it's no wonder they can't get a job, and then offer them to join the military instead. I think anyone under the age of about 25 should be able to opt out of all that workplace regulation nonsense. It's a prison. They are locked in an unemployment prison and they are not allowed out. And all the barbed wire and the walls and the machine guns and all the armed guards are just workplace regulations that prevent young people from doing exactly what we did when we were young.
Senator, in your view, what are the principal barriers to employment for young people in Australia?
Well, it's fairly simple that employing young people is too expensive, it's too complicated, and it's too risky. I meet lots and lots of small business owners who are working 7 days a week and 24 hours a day who would love some help. And when I say to them, have you thought about taking on a young person? They roll their eyes and talk about the cost and the complexity and the risk. And it's the young people who bear that risk. When I entered the workforce, and most baby boomers, the ones who are actually writing these laws, they were able to get into the workforce on the very low rung of the ladder when the cost and complexity was extremely low. But we've erected enormous barriers and obstacles to young people getting into the workforce. So the entry level is way too high. And when I first entered the housing industry in the early 1970s, there was no such thing as youth unemployment. It was a term that I'd never heard. There was full employment, and young people got a start in the workforce and on very low wage levels, and worked their way up, and they're all doing very nicely now. But we've prevented from young people from doing that today.
You've pointed out that one of the problems, particularly in South Australia, in relation to manufacturing, are the costs which the state are imposing in terms of energy. I'm wondering whether there are also costs in terms of the law relating to employment, which are forcing the closure of industries. In other words, trying to improve conditions in some industries or make them more protective seems to lead to those industries being lost to Australia.
Well, anything not based on economic reality is doomed to failure. And the basic economic reality is that people do things for their reasons, not anybody else's. People buy and sell things, and that's no more true than in the area of employment. Employers can only pay wages commensurate with the value of work that gets done. And this idea that some third party can arbitrarily impose costs and conditions on an input into manufacturing and it not have an effect is fanciful. And so that's we've seen that in South Australia, where we used to have a thriving manufacturing sector, where it is true that the wage levels were lower than in other states, but the quality of life and cost of living was much lower in South Australia as well. And in particular, housing costs and commuting costs and so on. But then centralised wage fixing comes along, and awards decree that it doesn't matter where the manufacturing base is or where a manufacturer is located, awards determine what wages have to be paid, and it becomes uncompetitive. And that has been the sad story of South Australia over the last 30 years.
And just one final issue, if I may, and that is in the 90s it was argued that we would improve our position in Asia, we would increase trade, our standing would increase if we removed the crown from the constitution and became a politician's republic. What's your view on that?
No, that's patent nonsense. I think the our monarch, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, has been on the throne now for 60 years, has probably the most respected human being on the planet. And I think constitutional monarchies are probably the envy of many unstable countries around the world that just wish they had what we had. And the idea, in fact, people used to say to me during the Republican debate, about the Queen, and well, what does the Queen do? And I would respond and say, it's not what she does, it's what she stops other people from doing.
Yes, that is a wonderful answer. Thank you very much, Senator, and the best of luck in your campaign to retain your position in the Senate as Senator for South Australia.
Good to talk to you too, David.
Thank you.